The city was alive that evening. Neon lights flickered above crowded sidewalks, cars honked impatiently as they crawled through the traffic, and the smell of street food drifted through the night air. Inside the Harbor Grill, one of the city's busiest restaurants, warmth and chatter replaced the chaos of the streets. Couples laughed over wine, families shared meals, and a few lone souls sat at their tables, savoring the weekend's simple luxury peace. At a corner booth, deliberately chosen for its quiet, sat Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell. Dressed in casual jeans and a dark sweater, she looked like any other woman unwinding after a long week. Only those who knew her personally, and there were few in this city, would recognize the disciplined posture, the way her eyes instinctively scanned the room, or the subtle tension in her shoulders that never really left her. Sarah wasn't here for recognition. She had returned home less than a month ago, after a demanding deployment overseas with the Navy. Months of training missions, endless days at sea, and the unrelenting responsibility of leading younger sailors had left her drained. Tonight was meant to be hers. No orders, no radios, no schedules. Just a quiet meal, a glass of wine, and the unfamiliar but welcome silence of civilian life. She stirred her drink absently, watching the condensation slide down the glass. Around her, life continued in small, pleasant bursts, waiters balancing trays, a birthday song erupting at the far end, a child dropping a fork and giggling. Sarah let herself breathe, a small smile tugging at her lips. She missed normalcy more than she ever admitted. The peace lasted only 20 minutes. The restaurant door swung open, and with it came a gust of loud, boisterous laughter. 5 men stumbled inside, shoulders bumping, their voices rising above the gentle murmur of the dining room. They were in their late 20s, dressed in casual button-ups, but their swagger screamed recklessness. One nearly tripped over the welcome mat, catching himself and shouting something crude that made the hostess flinch. Sarah's eyes flicked toward them automatically. Years of military service had wired her brain to notice disruption, to mark potential threats. She studied them in seconds, slightly intoxicated, overconfident, the kind who turned minor nights out into major problems. She looked away just as quickly. Not her problem. Not tonight. The men made their presence known immediately. They shoved each other playfully, laughed too loudly, and ignored the uneasy glances cast their way. Other diners lowered their voices, hoping to shrink into the background. The hostess seated the group near the center of the room, and already 2 waiters exchanged looks that said, "This is going to be trouble." Sarah refocused on her meal, determined to block out the noise. She had dealt with far worse than 5 loud drunks. But she noticed the shift in their tone when one of them caught sight of her. It started subtly. A whisper, a laugh, a raised eyebrow. Then the deliberate turning of their chairs, so their view pointed directly at her booth. She kept her eyes on her plate, but her hearing sharpened. "Look at her," one muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "Yeah, sitting all by herself, probably waiting for someone. Or maybe she just wants company." Laughter followed. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had learned to let words pass through her like wind. Still, she noted the quickening rhythm of her heart, not from fear, but from the anticipation that this was heading somewhere dangerous. Minutes ticked by. Their conversation grew louder, their attention more focused. Finally, one of them stood, glass in hand. He swaggered toward her booth with the lazy arrogance of someone certain he'd be admired for it. The room's conversations faltered. Diners pretended not to watch, but eyes darted toward the unfolding scene. He stopped at her table, leaning across it as though invited. "Hey there," he slurred, his grin wide and careless. "Didn't want to see you drinking all by yourself. How about some company?" Sarah lifted her eyes to his, steady and unflinching. She spoke softly, but each word carried sharp edges. "Step back." For a moment, he blinked, as if unsure he'd heard her correctly. He expected nervous laughter, maybe polite rejection. But the firmness in her tone, the authority that came from years of command, pierced his drunken fog. His grin faltered. He straightened, muttering something about not being interested anyway, and slunk back to his group. His pride, however, was bruised, and his friends wasted no time mocking him for it. Their laughter grew harsher, louder, echoing across the restaurant. Sarah exhaled slowly, her hand steadying her drink. She had hoped that would end it, but experience told her otherwise. From their table, the men whispered, pointed, and jeered. Their laughter was no longer just drunken noise. It was directed, sharp, and cutting. Diners exchanged uneasy glances. A woman at the table beside Sarah whispered to her husband, "Should we call someone?" But no one moved. Fear of escalation held them captive. Sarah sat still, her face unreadable. But inside, she replayed scenarios. If they come closer, what's the fastest way to de-escalate? What's the safest way out without causing panic? What's the line between defense and aggression? She had fought in real battles where lives were measured in seconds. Yet somehow, this ridiculous scene in a restaurant felt heavier. Civilian life demanded restraint. Every move here would be judged, replayed, filmed. She wasn't just a Navy officer. Tonight, she was a woman in a restaurant. The men didn't let it go. Another stood, clapping his hands loudly, as though performing for the room. "Hey, sweetheart, don't ignore us. We're just trying to have a little fun." His words dripped with mockery, each syllable designed to provoke. Sarah raised her eyes once more, calm and unyielding. She didn't speak this time. She didn't need to. Her silence, her stillness, unsettled him more than words could. He scowled and gestured to his friends. One by one, they rose, circling their table until their attention fully converged on her. Conversations in the restaurant dropped to whispers. The staff froze, their fear palpable. Phones began to appear discreetly, screens glowing as patrons prepared to record what everyone knew was about to happen. Sarah hadn't moved an inch. Her hands remained folded neatly in front of her. But in her mind, something shifted. She was no longer just Sarah Mitchell, woman on leave. She was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, U.S. Navy, and if the men chose to cross the line, she would respond with the precision and control that years of training had carved into her very bones. For now, though, she waited. Her eyes, cool and sharp, locked on the man nearest her. The room held its breath, and in that silence, the first signs of real trouble began to take shape. The men's laughter turned sharper, less like joy and more like a weapon aimed at their chosen target. Sarah sat unmoved, sipping her drink, her gaze fixed not on them, but on the small candle flickering at the center of her table. To the casual eye, she looked indifferent. But those who truly observed, if any dared, would see the subtle readiness in her posture. The first man, the one she had sent back with a curt command, tried to laugh off his embarrassment. He puffed out his chest, slapped the shoulder of his nearest friend, and forced a grin. But his eyes betrayed the sting. No one liked being humiliated in front of a crowd, especially not men like him, who lived for approval and dominance. "Come on," one of them sneered, elbowing him. "Don't tell me she shut you down that easy." "I wasn't even trying," he muttered, though his voice cracked under the strain. "She's nothing special. Probably thinks she's too good for us." Their banter grew louder, intentionally so. Sarah knew the tactic. Draw attention, create pressure, force her into a reaction. She had seen this before in bars near bases, in foreign ports, in places where alcohol loosened tongues and pride demanded foolish contests. Only this time, she wasn't among fellow sailors. She was surrounded by civilians, people who had no idea what was about to unfold. "Hey, sweetheart," another man called across the room. "You don't gotta sit there alone. We'll keep you company." More laughter followed, this time joined by a few awkward chuckles from patrons who wanted to diffuse the tension with humor. But the unease spread like smoke. Parents pulled children closer. Couples leaned together, whispering nervously. Sarah placed her glass down slowly, the sound of it meeting the table soft but deliberate. She had learned long ago that words meant little until they were backed with conviction. And conviction could be expressed in silence, in posture, in the unwavering calm of someone who refused to be moved. The second man rose, emboldened by his friend's failure. He swaggered toward her, a predator circling what he thought was prey. His steps were heavy, his smirk wide, his confidence fueled by alcohol and ego. He stopped at her booth, resting one hand on the edge of her table. "You look tense," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Relax a little. We're just being friendly." Sarah looked up, her eyes locking onto his with a steadiness that made him falter for just an instant. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Her face was unreadable, a wall he couldn't scale. "Sit down," she said quietly. Her tone wasn't raised, but it cut through the noise around them. It wasn't a request, and it wasn't anger. It was authority. The kind of voice that came from commanding sailors on a deck in the middle of a storm. The kind of voice that left no room for negotiation. The man froze. His friends jeered behind him, shouting encouragement, mocking his hesitation. Pride won again. He leaned closer, lowering his face to hers. "Come on, don't be like that. Just one smile." Sarah didn't move. She didn't blink. She let the silence stretch until even he felt its weight. Then slowly she said, "You don't want to do this." The warning was clear, though he laughed it off, retreating with forced bravado. His friends erupted in raucous laughter, their voices now carrying across the restaurant like thunder. "2 strikes." One of them shouted. "She's colder than ice." "Maybe she's scared," another chimed in, his eyes glinting with a challenge. Sarah reached for her fork, calmly continuing her meal as though nothing had happened. But inside, her mind was calculating. She noted each man's stance, their weight distribution, the distance from her table to the door, the positioning of nearby furniture. Years of training made it second nature. She didn't want to fight, but if it came, she would end it quickly, decisively, and with minimal collateral damage. Meanwhile, the staff exchanged frantic glances near the kitchen entrance. The young hostess whispered to the manager, her voice trembling. "Should we call the police?" The manager hesitated. "Not yet. If we do, and nothing happens, we'll look like we can't handle our customers. Just keep an eye." The calculation wasn't lost on Sarah. She had seen this before bystanders, hoping the situation would resolve itself, reluctant to act until it was too late. It wasn't cowardice, not exactly. It was the paralysis of normalcy. Ordinary people weren't trained to intervene in conflict. They froze, waiting for someone else to take responsibility. But in the growing silence between laughter and jeers, Sarah could feel the shift. It wasn't just harmless banter anymore. The men's pride was wounded, and wounded pride was dangerous. The third man stood abruptly, knocking his chair back so hard it clattered against the floor. Heads turned instantly. His friends cheered him on, pounding the table like drums. "All right," he boomed, his voice thick with alcohol. "Enough playing games. Let's see if the Ice Queen melts." He strutted toward her, each step heavy with drunken confidence. He stopped directly beside her booth, so close that Sarah could smell the sharp bite of whiskey on his breath. "Hey," he said, his tone falsely sweet. "Why don't you give me a smile?" Sarah turned her head, her eyes meeting his. She didn't speak. She didn't flinch. A silence stretched again, heavier this time. He leaned closer, his hand reaching toward her shoulder. The air in the restaurant shifted. Conversation stopped entirely. Forks hovered in midair. Phones tilted higher, recording. Parents shielded children's eyes. The staff froze in place, their faces pale. Sarah's hand, resting lightly on the table, curled slightly. Her body was still, but her muscles coiled like springs. She could end this before his fingers even grazed her. But restraint demanded patience. She waited for the exact moment when words gave way to action, when she could justify what came next. "Come on," he whispered, his grin wide. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The tension reached its peak, a fragile thread stretched to breaking. Sarah's eyes, cold and unwavering, flickered with something none of the men recognized, but every trained warrior would: the calm before decisive violence. And though the diners around her didn't know it yet, the restaurant was about to erupt into chaos. The third man's hand hovered inches from Sarah's shoulder. Time slowed, or at least it felt that way to everyone watching. Forks clinked softly back onto plates. Conversations died entirely. Even the kitchen noise seemed to fade, as if the whole restaurant was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when that hand finally crossed the invisible line. Sarah didn't move. Her stillness wasn't weakness. It was coiled patience, the kind of controlled calm that unnerved men who thrived on provoking reactions. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the loudest response. But silence, she also knew, had its limits. The man's fingertips brushed her sweater. That tiny contact sent a ripple of tension across the room. A few patrons gasped audibly. Others raised their phones higher, capturing the moment. "Hey!" A voice shouted from somewhere in the back, someone's attempt to intervene. It was ignored. The man smirked. "See? Not so tough." His friends roared with laughter. They stood now, encircling Sarah's booth like a pack of wolves. Their voices rose, overlapping insults and mockery. "Thought you were too good for us? Look at her, she's frozen. Maybe she likes it after all." The words rolled together into a toxic chorus. Yet through it all, Sarah remained motionless, her eyes locked on the man still leaning into her space. She wasn't frozen. She was calculating. In her mind, she measured distances, the angle of his wrist, the position of his weight on his front leg, the reach of his friends who circled closer. She mapped exits, noted obstacles, cataloged potential risks to bystanders. Years of training had made her brain an instinctive battlefield computer. She saw the next move before it happened. The man sneered, emboldened by her stillness. His hand slid further, fingers curling as if to grip her shoulder. That was the line. Sarah moved. Her hand shot up, seizing his wrist in an iron grip. Before he could react, she twisted sharply, bending his arm backward. The motion was so fast, so fluid, that it seemed almost invisible until he cried out, stumbling to his knees beside her booth. The restaurant gasped in unison. Chairs scraped, glasses clattered, and the sudden eruption of motion shattered the fragile tension. "What the?" one of his friends shouted, rushing forward. Sarah rose to her feet, smooth and deliberate. She didn't posture. She didn't threaten. She simply stood, eyes sharp, her stance balanced, her presence suddenly commanding the entire room. The man on the floor groaned, clutching his twisted wrist, while his friends froze for half a second, unsure what they had just seen. That pause, tiny but crucial, was the difference between control and chaos. "You need to stop," Sarah said evenly. Her voice wasn't raised, but the authority in it carried across the room. But pride is a powerful drug, and alcohol only magnified it. The men sneered, puffed out their chests and closed in tighter. "She thinks she's tough," one spat. 5 against 1, another jeered. "She's done." The restaurant manager stepped forward timidly, raising his hands. "Gentlemen, please let's calm down." "We don't want." "Shut up," one of the men barked, shoving the manager aside. The manager stumbled back, nearly knocking over a waiter. That single act silenced any thought that this was harmless drunkenness. The men weren't just being rowdy. They were becoming dangerous. Sarah took one step forward, her body angled slightly, weight balanced on the balls of her feet. It was a subtle shift, but one that radiated readiness. To the untrained eye, she looked calm. To anyone with military experience, it was obvious. She was preparing for a fight. The second man lunged, swinging clumsily at her shoulder, as though to shove her. Sarah sidestepped, his momentum carrying him forward. With a quick pivot, she guided his arm past her body, sending him crashing into the side of a table. Plates shattered, silverware clattered to the ground, and diners screamed, scrambling out of the way. The third man cursed, grabbing a chair and raising it like a weapon. Before he could bring it down, Sarah stepped in, driving her elbow into his ribs. The chair dropped from his hands, clattering uselessly to the floor. He gasped, stumbling backward, clutching his side. Chaos erupted. Patrons screamed, chairs toppled, and waiters fled toward the kitchen. Some people darted for the door, while others crouched low, clutching their children. Phones recorded shakily from behind overturned tables. Through it all, Sarah was steady. Her breathing was controlled, her movements precise. This wasn't rage. This wasn't panic. It was training, pure, efficient, disciplined. The man with the twisted wrist staggered to his feet, red with humiliation. He swung wildly, a drunken punch aimed at her jaw. Sarah ducked, grabbing his arm and using his momentum to flip him over her shoulder. He landed hard on his back, the breath knocked out of him. Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered, "Did you see that?" She barely touched him. But there was no time for amazement. 2 of the remaining men charged at once, hoping to overwhelm her with numbers. Sarah pivoted, catching one by the collar and shoving him into his friend. They collided, stumbling into a table and knocking over glasses of wine. The crash echoed like gunfire. The 5th man, the one who had hung back until now, grabbed a bottle from a nearby table, smashing it against the edge until it broke into jagged glass. Diners screamed in terror. The stakes had risen from harassment to deadly threat in an instant. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She had dealt with weapons before, but never in the confined chaos of a restaurant surrounded by civilians. This required speed and control. He lunged, slashing wildly. Sarah sidestepped, grabbing his wrist with one hand and striking his elbow with the other. The bottle flew from his grip, spinning across the floor before shattering harmlessly against a wall. In the same motion, she swept his legs, sending him crashing onto his back. Silence fell for a heartbeat. Diners gaped in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. A single woman, standing calm and unbroken, had dismantled 4 attackers in less than a minute. The last man groaned, dragging himself to his feet, rage and disbelief twisting his features. His friends were sprawled around the room, groaning, clutching bruises, their arrogance shattered. But he refused to stop. He charged. Sarah met him head-on. She sidestepped, hooked his arm, and guided his momentum into the corner of a booth. He slammed into it with a thud, collapsing in defeat. The restaurant fell silent, except for the groans of the 5 men. Patrons peeked over tables, phones still recording, eyes wide with awe and disbelief. Sarah stood in the center of the chaos, steady, her chest rising and falling with calm breaths. She adjusted her sweater, brushing off dust as though she had merely stood up from her seat. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply stood there, a quiet storm that had passed as quickly as it had arrived. The 5 men, who had entered the restaurant as predators, now lay scattered like broken glass. And for the first time that night, the crowd understood. This woman was not ordinary. The restaurant buzzed with stunned silence after the first skirmish. 5 men who had swaggered in minutes ago now groaned on the floor, clutching ribs, elbows, and pride. Dishes lay shattered, chairs overturned, wine dripping from broken glasses onto the polished wood floor. For a brief moment, Sarah thought it might be over. She hadn't wanted to fight, not tonight, not ever in this setting, but she had been pushed past the line of tolerance. Her body thrummed with controlled adrenaline, every muscle sharp, every breath measured. She scanned the room quickly. Patrons crouched low behind booths, some holding up phones to capture what had just unfolded. The staff huddled near the kitchen doors, wide-eyed, frozen between fear and awe. The air smelled of spilt alcohol, food, and something else, panic. One of the men groaned and tried to stand. His face was red with rage, not pain. Humiliation burned hotter than his bruises. He stumbled toward Sarah, staggering like a bull that refused to admit defeat. "Get up," he shouted to his friends. "She's just a woman. Get up." The words stung with the bitter taste of denial. His pride wouldn't allow him to see what the crowd already knew. Sarah was no ordinary woman, and no ordinary opponent. The others stirred, slowly rising, battered but not finished. Their eyes were glassy with alcohol, but beneath the drunken haze burned fury. They hadn't expected resistance, let alone defeat. Now their egos demanded vengeance. Sarah's stance shifted subtly, feet apart, knees bent, body balanced. It wasn't theatrical, it was functional, efficient. The stance of someone trained to move in any direction at a split second's notice. She didn't clench her fists or puff her chest. She simply waited, calm and ready. The leader charged first, head lowered, fists swinging wildly. Sarah pivoted, sidestepping with surgical precision. As he passed, she caught his arm, redirected his momentum, and sent him sprawling into a table. Plates clattered, diners shrieked, and he collapsed in a heap. Another came from behind, reaching for her hair in a drunken, desperate grab. Sarah ducked low, sweeping her leg in a wide arc. His knees buckled, and he crashed backward onto the floor with a grunt. The crowd gasped in unison. To them, it looked impossible. A lone woman dismantling full-grown men as if she were swatting away flies. But Sarah wasn't fighting for spectacle. She was fighting with control. Every move was calculated. Disable, neutralize, prevent escalation. One man grabbed a chair, swinging it like a club. Sarah stepped into him, closing the distance before the chair could build force. She struck his wrist sharply, and the chair fell from his grip. A palm strike to his chest sent him stumbling backward, breathless. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. For a heartbeat, the restaurant froze. Even the attackers paused, their chests heaving, sweat dripping, confusion flashing across their faces. Sarah's voice wasn't a plea. It was a command, calm, authoritative, the kind of tone that made sailors snap to attention on deck. But alcohol and pride are stronger than reason. The 5th man, the one who had smashed a bottle earlier, lunged again. This time, he held a steak knife, snatched hastily from a nearby table. Gasps erupted. Someone screamed. A child began to cry. Sarah's eyes sharpened. The escalation had reached deadly territory. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was a weapon in a crowded room. He thrust clumsily, aiming for her stomach. Sarah twisted sideways, catching his wrist in one hand. In the same motion, she drove her knee into his arm, forcing him to drop the knife. It clattered harmlessly onto the floor. She shoved him back with controlled force, sending him crashing into his own friends. The crowd erupted into applause and shouts. Some cheered, others gasped, and several screamed for someone to call the police. Sarah exhaled slowly, eyes sweeping the room again. She wasn't just focused on the attackers. She was assessing the crowd, making sure no one else was in danger, ensuring children were shielded, noting where the chaos might spill next. The men regrouped, groaning, their bodies battered, but their pride unwilling to quit. They circled her again, slower this time, warier. They weren't used to fighting someone who anticipated every move, someone who used their own momentum against them. One of them spat blood onto the floor. "She's military," he muttered, realization dawning in his slurred voice. The others exchanged glances. Something about that word military struck a chord. For the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. Sarah straightened slightly, her breathing steady. She could end this now. But she also knew men like this didn't walk away unless forced. And as long as they refused, she would remain in control. Another charged. Sarah sidestepped, caught his arm, and twisted until he cried out, collapsing to the floor again. She released him instantly, stepping back. She never held longer than necessary. She didn't fight out of malice. She fought to end conflict with precision. The others hesitated now, their earlier bravado fading into something closer to fear. They exchanged uncertain glances, their drunken courage cracking under the weight of reality. Sarah's eyes swept over them. "Walk away," she said firmly. Her words hung in the air. The crowd, still crouched behind tables and booths, leaned forward, waiting for the men's response. For a long moment, no one moved. The attackers breathed heavily, their chests rising and falling, sweat dripping from their foreheads. Their faces were masks of fury and humiliation, but beneath it all, they knew the truth. They couldn't beat her. One by one, they lowered their eyes. Not out of respect, out of defeat. The leader growled, his pride refusing to surrender fully. "This isn't over," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at Sarah. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She simply stood tall, steady, her silence louder than any retort. The man backed away slowly, dragging his groaning friends with him. They stumbled toward the exit, their arrogance shattered, their humiliation complete. The restaurant erupted in applause. Diners clapped, some stood, and others shouted words of gratitude. A child peeked over the back of a booth, eyes wide with awe. "She's like a superhero," he whispered to his mother. Sarah exhaled slowly, letting her shoulders drop. Adrenaline still coursed through her veins, but she forced her body back into calm. She brushed off her sweater, adjusted her hair, and returned to her booth as though nothing had happened. The staff approached cautiously, their eyes wide. "Ma'am, are you okay?" the manager asked, his voice trembling. Sarah nodded. "I'm fine." But inside, she knew the night was far from over. The men might have left, but the consequences of their actions and her response were only beginning. The sound of sirens echoed faintly outside, growing louder. The police were on their way. The sirens grew louder until flashing blue and red lights bathed the restaurant's walls in a pulsing glow. Patrons whispered nervously, some hurrying to put their phones away, while others clutched them tighter, eager to upload their shaky footage to social media. The sound of tires screeched against pavement, and the heavy slam of car doors broke the tense silence. Moments later, the restaurant doors swung open. Two uniformed officers stepped in, hands instinctively resting on their holstered weapons. Behind them followed another pair, scanning the scene. Their eyes darted quickly between overturned tables, shattered glass, and the groaning bodies of the men Sarah had dropped to the floor. What the hell happened here? One officer barked. No one spoke at first. Diners glanced at each other, unsure who would break the silence. Finally, the restaurant manager hurried forward, his apron stained with spilled wine. It wasn't her fault, he stammered, pointing toward Sarah. They attacked her. She defended herself. All eyes turned to Sarah, who stood quietly beside her booth, calm and collected despite the chaos around her. She had already slipped her hands into view, resting them loosely at her sides open, non-threatening. Her military instincts told her one thing clearly: control the perception of the situation. One of the men on the floor groaned, clutching his ribs. She jumped us, he sputtered weakly. Crazy woman just attacked. Liar! Someone shouted from a booth. A chorus of voices followed, angry, indignant, protective of the woman who had just saved the room from disaster. Several diners stood, speaking at once. She told them to stop. They grabbed her first. She saved us. One of them had a knife. An officer raised his hands. All right, quiet down. His gaze returned to Sarah. Ma'am, I need you to step forward. Sarah obeyed without hesitation, moving with measured steps. Her posture was upright, but not aggressive, her tone calm when she spoke. I defended myself, and I made sure no one else was harmed. The officer studied her, his brow furrowing. There was something about the way she spoke, the clarity, the control, that didn't match the chaos he'd walked into. The second officer knelt beside one of the attackers, who was still struggling to sit upright. Is it true? He asked. You started this? The man groaned, refusing to answer. One of the patrons stepped forward, phone in hand. I recorded it, she said firmly. She didn't start anything. They harassed her, grabbed her, and then attacked. She only fought back. The officer took the phone, reviewing the footage briefly. His eyebrows rose slightly as he watched Sarah dismantle the men with surgical precision. This isn't some bar fight, he muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, Sarah remained silent, watching, waiting. She had been in high-stakes interrogations before, in combat zones where quick words could escalate or diffuse situations. This, though domestic, demanded the same discipline. Say only what's necessary. Let the evidence speak. The officer finally turned to her. Where'd you learn to fight like that? Sarah's eyes met his. Calm, unwavering, she answered. The United States Navy. A ripple passed through the room. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Patrons murmured, some nodding knowingly, others whispering in awe. The officer studied her for a long moment, then gave a short nod. The attackers were gathered, cuffed, and dragged to their feet, one by one. They spat insults, still drunk and humiliated, but none dared make another move. The crowd booed them openly now, shouting things like, cowards, and serves you right, as the men were escorted out. When the doors closed behind them, the restaurant exhaled in relief. Diners clapped softly again, but this time, it wasn't the wild applause of adrenaline. It was something quieter, filled with gratitude. The manager approached Sarah hesitantly. You saved my staff, he said, his voice thick with emotion. If that knife had... He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't even want to imagine. Sarah offered a faint smile. I did what I had to do. The police officer stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Off the record. You could have hurt them a lot worse. Sarah didn't reply right away. She glanced at the overturned tables, the spilled wine, the faces of frightened families now calming. Finally, she said quietly, restraint is also part of training. The officer studied her for another beat, then nodded in understanding. As the chaos settled, Sarah returned to her booth briefly to collect her belongings. Her jacket lay folded on the seat where she had left it, her unfinished glass of water still sweating on the table. For a moment, she felt the weight of fatigue pressing down. The adrenaline that had carried her through the fight began to fade. leaving behind the heavy toll of discipline maintained under pressure. She slid her arms into her jacket, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. Every action, every choice was rooted in training. In the Navy, she had been taught to remain calm when others panicked, to act decisively when others froze. Tonight, that training had carried her not across seas or into combat zones, but into the middle of a restaurant on a quiet American street. Reality had met training and training had prevailed. But as Sarah turned to leave, she caught sight of a young girl near the back booth, peeking out from behind her mother's arm. The girl's eyes were wide, filled not with fear, but with admiration. When Sarah met her gaze, the girl whispered something that carried across the silence. "She's like a superhero." The word struck Sarah more deeply than she expected. She gave the girl a small nod, nothing more, then pushed open the restaurant doors and stepped into the cool night air. The flashing lights still strobed against the pavement. Officers were loading the attackers into squad cars, their angry shouts muffled by closed doors. A crowd had gathered outside, neighbors and bystanders craning their necks to see what had happened. Murmurs spread quickly. Some Navy woman took them all down. 5 guys, can you believe it? Sarah ignored the whispers. She had no interest in glory or attention. Her mission was simple: survive, protect, and move on. That was what her service had ingrained in her. As she walked down the sidewalk, the night air cooling her flushed skin, she realized that tonight had reminded her of something important. Her training wasn't just for battlefields oceans away. It was for moments like this, unexpected, ordinary nights when danger came uninvited, and people needed someone willing to stand up. Behind her, the police cars pulled away, sirens fading into the distance. The restaurant doors swung shut, muffling the voices inside. The city carried on, unaware of the storm that had just passed within one small corner of it. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter, exhaled slowly, and disappeared into the night. The city never stayed quiet for long. By the following morning, the story had already spread. Clips from the diner's shaky phone videos flooded social media, each caption more dramatic than the last. 1 woman versus 5 attackers, she won. Navy-trained hero saves restaurant. That discipline beats brute strength. Sarah's face appeared in grainy freeze frames, her body mid-motion twisting a wrist, dodging a strike, disarming a knife. Within hours, the videos had racked up thousands of views. By lunchtime, local news stations had aired the footage. By evening, it had made its way onto national broadcasts. But Sarah didn't see any of it. She had gone back to her base quarters, showered off the night's grime, and slipped into her uniform the next morning as if nothing had happened. Her day unfolded with the same rhythm as always. Reports to read, briefings to attend, and junior sailors to check in on. She refused to let one violent night redefine her. Still, the whispers followed her. In the mess hall, conversations dipped when she walked in. Younger recruits looked at her with wide-eyed awe, whispering about the videos they'd seen online. Some tried to hide their grins. Others gave her subtle nods of respect. Her commanding officer summoned her before noon. The man's office smelled faintly of coffee and old leather, the walls lined with photos from deployments past. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You want to tell me what happened last night?" he asked, voice even. Sarah sat across from him, spine straight, hands folded neatly on her lap. 5 men in a restaurant attempted to assault me, she said plainly. I neutralized the threat. His eyebrow rose slightly. That's a sterile way of putting it. The media's calling you a hero. I don't want that label, sir, Sarah replied firmly. I did what was necessary. Nothing more. He studied her for a long moment. Restraint. That's the word I keep hearing from the police reports and witness statements. You could have crushed them. You didn't. Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she thought of the little girl who had called her a superhero, of the knife clattering to the floor, of the way fear had rippled through the crowd, not because of her, but because of the men who thought intimidation was power. Finally, she said quietly, hurting them more wouldn't have made anyone safer. Her commanding officer gave a small nod. You'll be contacted by the media, no doubt. Decline interviews. That's an order. We don't need a circus. Yes, sir. That evening, Sarah tried to return to normalcy. She stopped by the same restaurant, not for attention, but to thank the staff who had been too shaken to speak the night before. The manager greeted her like family, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped hers. We've had this place for 20 years, he said, voice breaking. Never seen anything like that night. You saved us. You saved my staff. The waiters and waitresses stood nearby, watching her with quiet gratitude. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been older than 20, blurted, "The way you moved. I'll never forget it." Like you'd done it 1,000 times. Sarah smiled faintly. I have, she admitted. Not in restaurants, but in places much worse. They offered her a free meal, but she declined, leaving instead with only their thanks. By the end of the week, journalists had camped outside the base gates, holding up microphones, shouting her name whenever cars passed. Headlines spun their own versions of her story. Navy heroine saves diners. Female officer defies odds. 5 against 1 and she won. Sarah ignored it all. She had no interest in being turned into a spectacle. To her, it had never been about winning or showing power. It had been about ending a threat quickly and protecting innocent lives. Nothing more. But the world didn't see it that way. On Friday evening, she visited a small park near the waterfront. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, gulls circling lazily above. She sat on a bench overlooking the water, hoping for quiet. A man approached mid-40s, civilian clothes, a fatherly air about him. He stopped a few feet away, hesitant. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Are you the woman from the restaurant?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. He swallowed hard. "My wife and daughter were there. That little girl who called you a superhero. She's mine." His voice cracked. "I just wanted to say thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then said gently, "I'm glad they're safe. That's all that matters." Tears welled in his eyes. He gave a shaky smile, nodded, and left her in peace. Sarah stared out at the water long after he was gone. The reflection of city lights rippled across the waves, broken and reformed with every shift of the tide. Her training had carried her through battlefields and deployments, but it had also carried her through a restaurant on a quiet Friday night. And while the Navy demanded silence, discipline, and the refusal of glory, she couldn't shake the truth of what she had seen in that little girl's eyes. That courage, even when restrained, could inspire. Later that night, Sarah sat at her desk, her journal open. She wrote not about the fight itself, but about the feeling of being watched by the frightened, by the grateful, by the next generation. She wrote about restraint, about power held in check, about knowing when to act and when to stop. And she wrote one sentence that summed up everything she felt. Discipline is not what makes you strong. It's what makes you human. She closed the journal, shut off the lamp, and prepared for another day. For the world outside, she was the Navy woman who had taken down 5 men. For herself, she was simply Sarah Mitchell, an officer, a sailor, and someone who had done her duty when duty appeared in the unlikeliest of places. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Rows of benches creaked under the weight of curious onlookers, journalists, and family members who had gathered to witness the hearing. At the front sat the 5 men, now dressed in suits that looked borrowed, their expressions ranging from defiance to embarrassment. Sarah sat a few rows back, her uniform crisp, her posture rigid. She hadn't wanted to be here, but the subpoena had left no choice. As much as she wished to return to anonymity, the justice system demanded her presence. The judge entered, robes flowing, and the courtroom rose to its feet before sitting again. Papers shuffled, voices hushed. The prosecutor rose first, laying out the charges: attempted assault, possession of a weapon with intent, public endangerment. He played the videos from the restaurant, the shaky footage filling the courtroom screens. Gasps rippled through the audience as the images showed the men advancing, surrounding Sarah, and one brandishing a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor said firmly, "this is not a bar fight gone wrong. This is a coordinated group of men harassing, threatening, and ultimately attempting violence against a woman who was alone." She defended herself with extraordinary restraint. Had she not been present, someone else, perhaps many others, could have been seriously harmed. Sarah's jaw tightened at the word extraordinary. She had not wanted praise. But the evidence was clear. The defense lawyer shifted uncomfortably. He tried to paint the men as drunk, misguided, and remorseful. He claimed they had been provoked by embarrassment, that alcohol clouded their judgment. But the video footage spoke louder than his words. Every viewer could see the aggression, the escalation, and the knife glinting under the restaurant lights. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She walked to the witness stand, swore the oath, and sat upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court what happened that night?" Sarah's voice was steady. "I was seated at a restaurant, alone. A group of men entered and began harassing me verbally. I ignored them. When one leaned over my table and attempted to grab me, I told him to stop. They escalated. I acted to neutralize the threat." The prosecutor paced. "Did you at any point strike them before they physically engaged you?" "No," Sarah replied calmly. "Did you ever intend to harm them beyond what was necessary to protect yourself and others?" "No," she said again, her tone unwavering. "And where did you learn to respond with such precision?" Sarah hesitated briefly, then answered, "The United States Navy." The courtroom murmured, whispers rippling through the benches. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination. He tried to rattle her, asking if she had overreacted, if her military training made her too aggressive, if she had used excessive force. Sarah's gaze never wavered. "Sir," she said evenly, "if I had used excessive force, they would not be sitting here alive." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps and nods of agreement. Even the judge's eyebrows rose slightly at the blunt truth of her words. The defense attorney faltered, shuffling his papers, clearly outmatched not by theatrics, but by the unshakable calm of a woman who had spent years in command, under far harsher scrutiny. When her testimony ended, Sarah stepped down from the stand and returned to her seat. She could feel eyes following her, reporters, scribbling notes, spectators whispering. She ignored them all. Weeks later, the verdict came. All 5 men were found guilty of attempted assault and endangerment. The one who had wielded the knife faced additional charges for deadly weapon possession. Their sentences varied, but none would escape the shadow of what they had done. The media painted the verdict as justice served. News anchors repeated Sarah's quotes, spliced her courtroom testimony with the videos, and replayed the line, "If I had used excessive force, they would not be sitting here alive." That sentence spread across headlines, talk shows, and social media memes. Some hailed her as a role model. Others debated the use of force question endlessly, twisting her words into political arguments. But Sarah ignored it all. She didn't read the articles, didn't watch the interviews. She focused on her duty, her sailors, and her work. Still, the Navy could not ignore the attention. Her commanding officer called her into his office again, this time with a higher-ranking admiral present. The admiral was a stern man, his medals gleaming, his voice clipped. "You've become a symbol, Lieutenant Commander," he said bluntly. "Whether you like it or not, the public sees you as an example of military discipline in civilian life." Sarah shifted uneasily. "With respect, sir, I didn't ask for that." "No one asks for it," the admiral replied. "But you handled yourself with composure. The public saw not just a fighter, they saw restraint, professionalism, and discipline. That reflects on all of us." Her commanding officer nodded. "The Navy is proud of how you represented us, Sarah." She gave a crisp nod. "Thank you, sir." But inside, she felt the weight grow heavier. It wasn't pride she carried. It was the burden of knowing people were now looking at her, not just as an officer, but as a symbol. Later that evening, Sarah walked through the quiet streets near the waterfront. The city lights reflected on the bay, waves lapping gently against the docks. Her phone buzzed with another call from a reporter. She ignored it. Another text from a friend, forwarding a link to yet another article. She deleted it. All she wanted was silence. She sat on a bench, the same one she had visited days earlier, staring out at the endless horizon. The Navy had taught her that service was about something greater than herself. But the world wanted to reduce her to a headline, a story, a spectacle. Her thoughts drifted back to the restaurant. The clatter of chairs, the flash of the knife, the sound of a child whispering, "She's like a superhero." Sarah exhaled slowly. She hadn't fought to be remembered. She had fought because it was necessary. Because that's what she had sworn to do, protect others, even when no one was watching. And she knew then, as the waves rolled against the shore, that the true test of her resolve wasn't in combat or courtrooms. It was in living with the weight of being seen. For the 5 men, the story ended in prison sentences and public shame. For Sarah Mitchell, it was only another chapter in a life defined not by glory, but by duty. And though the country now knew her name, she carried it all with the same quiet discipline she had shown that night, unshaken, restrained, and resolute. The morning sun glinted off the calm surface of the bay as Sarah walked along the waterfront. Her uniform was pressed, but the weight of the last few weeks, the confrontation, the courtroom, the media storm still lingered. The city hummed quietly, life going on as though nothing had happened. For most, it hadn't. For Sarah, it had been everything. Her thoughts drifted to the restaurant, to the stunned diners and the 5 men sprawled on the floor. That night had been a test not of strength, but of patience, control, and judgment. She hadn't sought recognition, and yet the world had forced it upon her. She had been thrust into a narrative not of her choosing. She paused on a weathered bench overlooking the water, watching the tide roll in and out. The rhythm reminded her of life in the Navy, the ebb and flow of chaos and order, of danger and calm. She had always known that being a sailor was about more than missions or medals. It was about responsibility. And now, more than ever, she understood the weight of responsibility beyond the battlefield. Her phone buzzed. A news alert flashed. Navy heroine saves lives in restaurant attack. She ignored it, silencing the device. She had no need for the world to see her as a hero. Her actions had already mattered. The people in that restaurant knew. The families who had been protected knew. That was enough. Behind her, a small group of children played near the pier, laughing and chasing one another. Their joy was untainted by fame, politics, or fear. She smiled faintly, remembering the little girl who had called her a superhero. That simple act of recognition, innocent and unjudged, meant more than any headline, any viral clip, any public praise. Sarah's reflection was interrupted by the distant sound of a father calling his children back. Their voices carried across the water, a reminder that life went on. Ordinary people, Ordinary moments. These were what she had fought to protect. Not glory, not notoriety, not a place in the papers. She walked slowly along the pier, feet crunching against gravel, the wind tugging at her hair. For a moment, she felt the weight of the past weeks lift. She had acted. She had protected. She had upheld her oath. That was all that mattered. Back at the base, her sailors noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor. She moved through their ranks with calm authority, not needing to repeat the story of the attack or her role in it. Her presence alone, steady, unshaken, discipline, spoke louder than any words ever could. One of the younger sailors approached her hesitantly, glancing at her with admiration. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, I saw some of the footage online," he said quietly. "I just wanted to say thank you for showing us how to handle ourselves and for protecting those who couldn't." Sarah gave a small nod, her face calm. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "Do your duty. Protect others when you're called. That's all that matters." The sailor nodded, inspired but grounded by her words. Sarah turned and walked away, letting him digest the lesson in silence. She had learned long ago that the true measure of strength wasn't in recognition. It was in the ripple effect of responsibility. That evening, she visited the restaurant once more, this time quietly. The staff welcomed her with warm smiles, but she refused any special treatment. She didn't need praise, nor did she need reminders of the chaos that had unfolded. She merely wanted to leave the space as it had been intended, a place of calm, nourishment, and community. The manager approached, holding out a small framed photo someone had taken from the night of the attack. "You might want to keep this," he said. "It's history, in a way. People won't forget what you did." Sarah shook her head gently. "History isn't mine to keep," she said. "It belongs to everyone who survived that night. They were the ones who mattered." She left the restaurant quietly, stepping into the cool evening air. Neon signs flickered, casting light on the sidewalk, but she moved through it without pause. The city had seen her fight, the courts had seen her testimony, and the Navy had seen her discipline. But she didn't belong to the headlines. She belonged to the oath she had taken, to the people she protected, and to the quiet moments when no one watched. Days later, she returned to her routine at the base. Reports, briefings, drills, the rhythm of military life returned to normal. And yet, in those quiet hours between tasks, she reflected on the unexpected lessons of that night. She realized that courage wasn't always measured by battlefields or medals. Sometimes it was measured in restraint, in the ability to act decisively yet sparingly, in protecting others while keeping oneself grounded. It was about understanding that being a hero didn't require recognition. It required integrity, discipline, and the willingness to face danger not for applause, but because it was the right thing to do. And in the hearts of the diners, the families, and even the children who had watched from behind tables, Sarah Mitchell would always be remembered not as a headline, not as a viral sensation, but as a quiet force of courage and discipline. Walking along the pier one last time before nightfall, she watched the stars reflect on the water. She thought of her sailors, her friends, the people she had protected, and the 5 men who would now carry the consequences of their actions. She smiled faintly, not because she sought glory, but because she knew she had done her duty. And that, she realized, was enough. The world might never understand fully, but she didn't need it to. Sarah Mitchell, Navy officer, protector, disciplined warrior, had walked through fire, met chaos head-on, and emerged not seeking fame, but leaving a quiet, lasting legacy that would ripple far beyond the night of the attack. The pier was silent now, save for the gentle lap of waves and the distant hum of the city. And Sarah walked on, unshaken, resolute, and at peace with the life she had chosen, a life of service, discipline, and quiet heroism.